Okay, people, welcome to Investigation 14, and this is 14A2, the French Revolution, Image Analysis, and Claim Construction. So after watching Investigation 14A1, which is the French Revolution video, we move on to this investigation, A2, which is the image analysis and claim construction. So what are the directions? Let's take a look. Use the images, the graphic organizer, and the teacher video to perform analysis on the primary documents. Then construct a claim that directly responds to the prompt. Look at the bottom left, it says prompt. Was the French Revolution successful? Keep that question in mind as you move through the images and fill out the analysis. Let's go. So what we have on the left-hand side is the French Revolution primary images. What we have on the right-hand side is our image analysis grid. And this is the 14th time that we're now performing this type of image analysis in order to construct a claim. Remember, in yellow highlight, was the French Revolution successful? And keep that question in your mind, and each image you want to ask yourself, how does that image reflect on the prompt? This question, was the French Revolution successful? Let's take a look at image 1. All right, so image 1, what are we looking at? Okay, so if it's a picture of an individual and he looks all dressed up and he looks like a pretty important individual, and maybe this is like a painting of a really important individual. Let's look at the bottom. It says portrait of King Louis the 16th of France. Okay, this is King Louis, the 16th king of the country of France. And let's look at the blurb. The king, Louis the 16th, he was absolute. What does that mean? He was ruled by divine right theory, which held that he had received his power to govern from God and was therefore responsible to God alone. Okay? He appointed all civil officials and military officers. He made and enforced laws. He could declare war and make peace. He levied taxes and spent the people's money as he saw fit. He controlled the expression of thought by a strict censorship of speech and of press, like the newspaper. Okay, or speaking out. So the image source, well, it comes from Friedman and Fonner, a generic approach to modern European history, college entrance book. So that's a textbook. Okay, number 1, who's the speaker? There is no speaker, so put N-A. That's not applicable. There is no speaker. It's a picture. Okay. Now the occasion, the time and the place. Well, this is France. Does it give a time? Does not give a time of when this was painted, so we know that this was painted in France. Okay. The audience, who would look at this picture. Okay, so this is for anyone who wants to know the importance and power of King Louis the 16th. Okay, so when the audience looks at this, they say, oh, this person is very important, this person is very powerful. Okay, the King of France, this particular individual, King Louis. The purpose, it's to show power, importance, and to be remembered. Okay, that's most of all. This is to be immortalized, to be remembered hundreds of years later. After he's gone, King Louis the 16th, that people will always look at him, wow, that individual had a lot of power and a lot of importance. Okay, so now what is the meaning of this portrait, right? What is the message in this image? King Louis the 16th of France had significant power over the entire country. This is all about power, influence, and to be immortalized and remembered forever. Okay? So you can pause this video and rewind at any point to go back and fill out the grid. So as our story starts off, remember, what was the French Revolution successful? So we start out with the king who has all of the power. And we know, well, that's an unfair government, right? So now this revolution is going to take place. Let's take a look at image number 2. Oh my goodness, what happens to that king? He seems to have lost his head. Let's take a look. Okay, picture of the king. You zoom in, you can see his face right here. There it is. Now we zoom here, and there it is, cut off. The head of King Louis XVI. Okay, the artist or the maker is unknown. Oh, so the speaker's unknown, or NA. It's a picture. Okay. Published by Villeneuve, France, active 1789 to 1814, and the author of the text, Maximilien Robespierre, 1758 to 1794. So there's no text. So it's published. The image, this is in France, 1789 to 1814. During that time, this was pushed out in the newspapers. Okay, this image, and the audience. So, what would the audience think or see after looking at that? An unfair government. King lost his head to his people. Okay, so they murdered him. They cut his head off. You have to understand why. It was an unfair government, and they want to force a new system. Why do you have to take it as far as to cut the head off, right? We're going to figure that out in our research. Okay, now what is the purpose? Why would somebody create this image? To show the amount or degree of violence that was used during the French Revolution. Yeah, it's really to show the amount of violence. So if there's an unfair king or an unfair government, you want to overthrow the government, why do you have to go so far as to cut the person's head off? Well, that was a characteristic of the French Revolution, the amount of violence. And that's reflected in the previous video that you watched, right? So now what is the message here? Well, unhappy people of France used violence to overthrow the king, Louis XVI, and cut his head off. So you start off with a very wealthy, important, influential, powerful king who wants to be immortalized and remembered forever. And you might feel that's a little unfair. He made the laws. He controlled freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And he was very powerful. And people thought that was unfair, so they tried to overthrow the government. They cut his head off. And that's image 2. Okay, let's move on to image 3. Now what happens here? What do we see in the image? Well, we see a lot of people. They look like they're fighting. If you look closely, it looks like there's poor people in the image, and it looks like there's soldiers in the image. There's a giant castle in the background on fire. It looks like maybe the poor commoners are attacking the soldiers, and maybe they're attacking this castle or this fortress. Now let's read the blurb to see if we're right. The poor commoners storming of the Bastille Castle, the fortress of torture, July 14th, 1789. All right. So, what do we have here? Who's the creator or the speaker? We really don't have it. So that's NA. picture so we know when and where. This is Bastille Castle, right? The Fortress of Torture. And it's in July 14th, 1789. All right. Now, the audience, anybody who looks at this image, what should they think or feel? Well, this was for people to understand the power of the French commoners to overthrow the unfair government in France. Okay, so looking at this, you can see that the people reacted. The people were the protagonists. The people were the antagonists. They took action. They reacted, became violent, and forced change. Now, what is the purpose? Why would somebody, or why would a group of people do this? Think about what it would take for you to risk your life to push change in your society and your government. It's a reflection of how unfair life was. It's a reflection, I would say this is a reaction. It's a physical reaction. Toward the unfairness of life in France before the revolution. So this is the start of the revolution, but life was so unfair, people were so unhappy, came to a breaking point, and they rioted, became violent, and that turned to revolution. So, what is the message, the subject? What is the meaning here? Okay? When life becomes so unfair and a government becomes unfair, the people of France revolted and started a revolution. Okay. All right, there you go. So now you have image 1, image 2, and image 3. Was the French Revolution successful? And that's the question we need to keep in mind. So you have an unfair king and an unfair system of life, and he's beheaded. And the people take action to overthrow the unfair government, to change society. Were they successful? You need to look at images 4, 5, and 6 to decide for yourself if the French Revolution was successful. And it's very interesting, by the time you get to document 6, it's really going to challenge you to think, was the French Revolution successful? Take the rest of the time to finish images 4 through 6, and once you're done, you're going to draw 3 conclusions. Was the French Revolution successful? After considering the image-based evidence I realized, conclusion 1, conclusion 2, conclusion 3, and then you add those conclusions together to create a thesis statement. French Revolution was successful because of these 3 reasons, or the French Revolution was unsuccessful because of these 3 reasons. Or you could say, although this happened in France, the French Revolution was, and you can decide by making your claim. I hope this helps.